So we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Michael Hunter Schwartz. I'm the Dean of the McGeorge School of Law. I want to welcome all of our guests. I just realized that we even have guests from our Stockton campus, members of our Pacific Legal Advantage undergraduate program. So we range from undergrads to retired alumni and everything in between, and retired faculty. So we're very well represented across the spectrum of the McGeorge community. Welcome to the 19th of the 21 events of the celebration of McGeorge's Centennial, and our 9th and 10th Centennial speakers of the 12 we will hear from before the year is out. It has been a wild and joyous ride celebrating our 100th anniversary, and I'm so grateful to all of you who have hung in, particularly one person sort of in the back who I think has made every Centennial event from start to finish. It is my great honor to introduce the two people who really are without peers among those who I'm lucky enough to call both colleagues and friends. Once you hear their bios, which I had to edit down, to be honest with you, because I wanted to give them a few minutes to talk, you will conclude, as I have, that while they claim to be only two people, there may be two secret other people that are helping them get all their work done, because only 4 people could do what these 2 people do, and do it so well. And they could be so great at not just being the brilliant scholars that you're going to hear from, but wonderful teachers, wonderful colleagues, and having rich, happy, engaged, life-affirming lives. Their latest achievement with Professor Naomi Kahn, and who I discovered today, holds one of the other Anthony M. Kennedy distinguished professorships at some other school, I think University of Virginia, unlike our Anthony M. Kennedy chair. And we're going to hear about their book, which I believe you can see it on the screen, Fair Shake, Women and the Fight to Build a Just Economy. It's published by Simon & Schuster, and it's been described as a stirring, comprehensive look at the state of women in the workforce, why women's progress has stalled, how our economy fosters unproductive competition, and how we can fix the system that holds women back. I'll introduce each of them now. Nancy Levit is the Curatus Professor and Edward D. Ellison Professor of Law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. She teaches defamation and privacy, employment discrimination, gender and justice, jurisprudence and torts. That's just on Tuesdays, and is a faculty advisor to the UMKC Law Review. She is also a member of the UMKC's Women's and Gender Studies faculty and has previously taught courses in criminal law and constitutional law. The students have voted Professor Levit the law school's outstanding professor of the year 5 times, most recently in 2013 and 2015. She also received the Daniel L. Brenner Faculty Publishing Award 3 times, the Elmer P. Pearson Faculty Teaching Award 3 times, and the Campus NT Viach Award for Distinguished Research and Creative Activity. In 1998, she was named the law school's first Daniel L. Brenner Scholar. In 2000, she received a UMKC Trustees Faculty Fellowship. In 2001, she received the title of Edward D. Ellison Professor of Law. She also is one of the 26 professors featured in a book for which I have some affection, What the Best Law Teachers Do. And I had the great honor of being the member of the team that actually studied Nancy Levit's teaching. And I just want you to know, as I've been teaching remedies this fall, I've been stealing Nancy Levit ideas throughout the whole semester. And so I'm better at my job because I had the great honor of seeing her in action. Her scholarship is principally in the areas of employment discrimination, pedagogy, constitutional law, jurisprudence and torts, and feminist theory. She has a number of really important books, 2 from Oxford Press, one, The Happy Lawyer, Making a Good Life in the Law, and the sequel, The Good Lawyer, Seeking Quality in the Practice of Law. Those were published in 2010 and 2015. She has written about feminist legal theory, feminist legal theory primer from New York University Press, a jurisprudence book from West, Let's see, she also published The Gender Line, Men, Women, and the Law from NYU Press. And she's published in the California Law Review, George Washington University Law Review, Georgetown Law Journal, etc. She just stepped down from deep and lengthy service as an associate dean at UMKC Law School. Generally speaking, we're distorted at McGeorge because our associate deans serve way longer than Dean Moylan served for 5 years in the role, but Professor Levit, no longer Dean Levit, served 8 years in that role, what is generally regarded as the worst job in legal education. And when she's got nothing else to do, she enjoys distance running and sprint triathlons. So, June Carbone. June Carbone joined the University of Minnesota faculty in June 2013 as the inaugural holder of the Rabina Chair in Law, Science, and Technology, leaving her position as the Edward A. Smith Missouri Chair of Law, the Constitution and Society at the University of Missouri at Kansas City. She's an expert in family law, assisted reproduction, property and law, medicine, and bioethics, and she has taught contracts, remedies, financial institutions, civil procedure, and feminist jurisprudence on Tuesdays. Before joining UMKC, Professor Carbone was an associate professor and a professor of law at Santa Clara, beginning in 1987. From 2000 to 2006, she was an associate dean for faculty development, and from 2001 to 2003, the presidential professor of ethics and the common good, an appointment that supports ethics research at Santa Clara's Markula Center for Applied Ethics. She was a visiting scholar at Stanford University's Institute for Research on Women and Gender from 1995 to 96. She also was an assistant professor at George Mason and a trial attorney in the Civil Division Federal Programs Branch of the U.S. Department of Justice from 1978 to 1983. She writes quite prolifically. If I had to recite it all, we would not finish tonight. Including changes brought on by the biotechnology evolution. Her most recent books are Red Families versus Blue Families, Legal Polarization and the Creation of Culture from Oxford University in 2010, and Marriage Markets, How Inequality is Remaking the American Family from Oxford in 2014. I'll give you just a few of her honors: the 2010 Daniel L. Brenner Faculty Publishing Award from UMKC, the 2002 Santa Clara University Award for Recent Achievement in Scholarship over the previous 5 years, and the 2002 Santa Clara University Law School Award for Distinguished Scholarship. She's also been a member of the Yale Cultural Cognition Project since 2010. She also serves on every single, in my opinion, committee of the American Association of Law Schools, and the reason I believe that to be the case is every time I join a new committee of the AALS, June's already on it. So with that, Professors Carbone and Levit, the podium is yours.
Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you so much for giving us the comforts of home by sitting far back rather than in the front row. We're so used to this, and it just feels right. June and Naomi and I want to thank Monica Lopez and Judy Wynn for all of the kind arrangements they've made for us to be here, and especially Michael Hunter Schwartz for inviting us. I'm sure all of you know what a gem you have in this dean. Yes. The average decanal duration across the country is less than 4 years, and you have been able to keep him in this position for double that, which says something about all of you. He is one of, if not, if you had a basketball team and your starting lineup was the best deans ever, he's not only on it, he's playing point, right? And he is beloved, he is respected nationally, and I hear you get to keep him after his deanship, which is another anomaly in the legal field. So that speaks volumes about you. Let me just give you a brief bit about the genesis of Fair Shake. June and I used to be on the same faculty. June, Naomi, and I have written together for a number of years, written articles, and now this book. We teach and we write about gender, the family, employment discrimination, sexual harassment, gender wage gap. It's what we talk about a lot. In fact, we had originally named the book Shafted. Simon & Schuster said, that's too phallic. We said, duh. And so they workshopped it, and fair shake it is. When we started our research for the book, more than 7 years ago now, the overall figures showed that women were ever so slowly gaining on men, and the wage gap was narrowing. It seemed like promising news, except that after the mid-1990s, the only reason that women appeared to be gaining ground on men was almost entirely due to the fact that the blue-collar men were losing. The wages were falling dramatically during the same period. So we did a back-of-the-envelope calculation. You can see our back-of-the-envelope calculation here. It's not here for the math, but to show you where we started in our thinking. And we took the traditional formula for the gendered wage gap and then broke it down by levels of education. And when we looked at the numbers for college graduates, we realized that the gender gap in wages was increasing. At first, we struggled to believe our own findings. This couldn't be true, right? We'd heard, as I'm sure you have, that education is the key to advancement. And by 2000, women earned more bachelor's degrees. By 2006, women earned more doctorate degrees than men. But it was in these groups, the ranks of college graduates and the highest earners among them in particular, where gender disparities had grown the most at the fastest rate. And so the gender wage gap increases with education. For those with high school or less, gender wage gap's about 20%, college or advanced degrees 25%, and those with doctorate degrees more than that. There was a 2019 Goldman Sachs study showing that if present trends continued, women would not catch up with men in terms of wages for another 100 years or so. And by the time we finished the book, we realized that if present trends continued, women would never catch up. Indeed, the most recent reports show these predictions. They confirm it. They show that the gender wage gap as a whole between men and women increased between 2019 and 2023. So after 2 decades of progress in the 70s and the 80s, the advancement of women college grads stalled. We noticed something else was going on about the same time. CEO salaries were skyrocketing, and we discovered the two phenomena are linked. The winner-take-all era, which we will talk about, starts with an increase in CEO compensation. In the 1950s, 1960s, the ratio of CEO to average worker pay was about 20 to 1. Today, it is a mind-blowing 290 to 1. And wages took off in the areas of the economy where women weren't present to begin with. 57% of all the increases in wages across the economy from the mid-1980s through the financial crisis went to those who were in finance. And tech took off by running fast and making those who broke things rich. And then we discovered that it wasn't just that women were not in those fields, it was that the women who had made it were losing ground. Our thesis is that the new economy celebrates the people who could break the rules and get away with it. And I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. The short version is that CEO salaries take off. How, you asked? I'm glad you asked. They rigged the system. For whose benefit do they rig the system? For their own. There's a new corporate system. It's boosted CEO pay into the stratosphere, and it's created a winner-take-all environment within firms. The hyper-competition, the rewards for behaviors that produce short-term gains, competition for dominance that keeps everyone insecure, and systems in which the ambitious bend institutions to serve their own interests through the creation of new boys' clubs that outflank the restraints of the older order, enriching themselves at the expense of everyone else. This transformation in executive compensation brought back the robber barons mindset of no-holds-barred competition, of individualism at the expense of institutions, at the expense of communities, and a zero-sum worldview in which those who win by any means become the toast of the town. We use the term WTA economy, winner-take-all economy, to describe this critical shift as the ability of those at the top to take a much larger share of resources for themselves. Corporations have become essentially extraction devices for their CEOs. The new economy links CEO pay to share price, and it gives the justification for outsized bonuses to the top CEOs, and they give them to their lieutenants who help them deliver what Wall Street wants. You may remember a few months ago, Tesla's board of directors sought to, again, I think it was the second time, to approve a $47 billion, that's with the B, compensation package for Elon Musk. And amid much less fanfare, that same week, Tesla announced it planned to fire 10% of its global workforce, 14,000 workers. The Delaware Chancery Court threw out the proposed comp package, so what did Tesla do? They decided to move the host state for incorporation to Texas, which, as you can imagine, doesn't have the same rules or judges as those in Delaware. And wait for it, shareholders approved a $56 billion comp package for Musk, and we're waiting to see if that's going to be upheld. Elon Musk became the richest man in the world for a period when, in a 2-week time span, he both beat expectations on the number of Teslas his company was able to produce and weathered a callback of hundreds of thousands of his cars. I think they were the ones that looked like the 8th grade shop class fail, I'm not sure though, for product quality defects. And the stock market rewarded one, didn't care about the other. It's the appearance of success that can justify those excessive rewards in a system that doesn't ask too many questions about how the appearances are created. So it's not just Musk. Wells Fargo, simply by reporting opening more new accounts, even though they faked the numbers, remember that one, was viewed as the most successful bank in the country following the financial crisis. Winner-take-all workplaces pit people against each other for competitive bonuses. They reward the people who bring in the desired numbers, and they don't inquire too closely about how the workers are getting those results. Practices like these, as we're going to be talking about tonight, are linked to hostile, bullying, and sexist climates, which increase gender disparities at work. The problem isn't that women are losing, it's that women are the canaries in the coal mine, and everyone is going to lose. The secret to success in this new economy is breaking the rules and getting away with it, and women can't get away with it. We've identified why. Women face a triple bind. The secret to success in the new economy, it doesn't work with women. If women don't compete on the same terms as men, they lose, right? They're not in the game. And they don't understand the hidden rules of the game, as June's going to talk about. Second, if women do compete on the same terms as men, they're punished more harshly for their sharp elbows or legal and ethical misdeeds. So if women are trying to compete on the same terms as men, they also lose when scandals occur, because when scandals need scapegoats, women are convenient ones. In fact, there's a fascinating article entitled "When Harry Fired Sally." Harvard economist Mark Egan, whom we interviewed for the book, demonstrated that women who commit misconduct in finance are more likely to be fired by 20% and less likely to be hired by 30% than men who commit even greater offenses. Men who are perceived to be narcissists by their subordinates are also rated as more effective bosses. Women who are narcissists are rated as less effective bosses. They just can't get away with those traits. The third leg of the triple bind is that when women see that they can't win on the same terms as men, they take themselves out of the game if they haven't been pushed out already. Powerful institutional factors make these high-stakes jobs less attractive for women and push many women out who would otherwise make effective leaders. It is no accident that Walmart became the subject of the largest sex discrimination suit in the country's history, and that it's also the corporation that's been ranked #1 in the country for wage and hour theft. And that's where we begin to unpack the triple bind.
So Nancy has given you a complete summary of the book. If you decide you want to read it, what Simon & Schuster made us do is to try to make it a little bit more accessible by telling the stories of women who've sued. And then we did the backstory, what really happened. So I'm going to start with Betty Dukes, the lead plaintiff in the largest sex discrimination class action in history, included in many civil procedure texts, a 5-4 decision with Justice Scalia writing for the Supreme Court and denying class certification. We looked at Betty Dukes, and we had an initial draft of how no-brainer for management, 20 years of experience in retail, steady promotions, and then hits a glass ceiling. But we're going to tell you what really happened. So first, we spent a lot of time reading newspaper articles from the East Bay Times. Betty Duke's story, the 7th of 11 children born to a single mother, dropped out of high school, 2 failed marriages, some minor arrest records, a DUI, possessing a weapon while intoxicated. She hit rock bottom. She thought about ending it. And then she discovered God. When she discovered God, she got her GED. She became an ordained Baptist minister. She became a community activist. She needed a job, and Walmart was hiring. And when she went to work for Walmart, she thought she had found her place. Walmart prided itself on its Christian values and made no bones about being Christian. And she had the experience of steady promotions, part-time to full-time, full-time to becoming a community service manager. That's that category in the far right. It is the highest level you can achieve at Walmart's while still being an hourly employee, and it's almost 90% women. What about the store manager role? That's, at the time of the suit, under 20% women. She tried to get into management training. She pressed hard. And then she pressed too hard, and they demoted her because her cash register was a couple cents off. And she filed a complaint with the EEOC alleging racial discrimination. And that's when the folks putting together the sex discrimination suit, the largest in American history, found her, and she became the lead plaintiff, a role that she performed with immense pride. And what we discovered when we looked into this is rather than a story of unconscious bias, sex stereotyping, or even racial discrimination, Walmart went out of its way to settle racial discrimination claims. It fought sex discrimination claims. And here's the story we came up with. Nancy has already mentioned Walmart is first in the country in wage theft, but this is the part I want you to focus on. On the left are the policies identified in the class action that are bad for women. One of the things is Walmart, in the old days, required that management trainees agree in writing to be willing to move. Sam Walton admitted in his autobiography in 1992 that makes it harder to recruit women, and they were going to change the policy. They simply stopped putting it in writing. The Supreme Court admitted it was a policy, a condition for promotion, and they made a point of moving managers around every 2 to 3 years, often on short notice, hundreds of miles away. They had a policy, don't hire from employees from the same store to become managers. The positions were not advertised. There were no criteria. Walton used to brag. He preferred B and C students to A students. I want you to know A students are more likely to be women. They're also more likely to be rule followers, especially since he recruited at Bible colleges and the branch campuses of state universities. And managers worked long and unpredictable hours, partly because Walmart had a policy of chronic understaffing. But there's another part to the story. He wanted managers who identified with the company, not employees. There was a remarkably uniform culture at Walmart, which it achieved by moving managers from store to store. The key to the uniform culture was its bonus system. Total sales divided by labor costs and only labor costs. Walmart also had a policy of never paying overtime. Well, if you're chronically understaffed and the goal of the manager is to reduce costs, you got to figure out a way to fill in the gaps, and it often did it by not paying overtime to workers who had earned it, talking them into checking out, checking back in, and sometimes simply not paying them for hours worked. The system selected for people, the C students, who didn't have a lot of options elsewhere, who couldn't easily jump ship because another company wouldn't hire them. And so it looked for people who were hungry, amoral, and willing to do what it takes to make the bonus. And what it did, annual audits. The managers who were successful would be moved to another store, no questions asked, to implement the same system. The managers who weren't successful, and Walmart fired 10 to 15% of its managers every year, even in good years, they would be audited. And if they were found to have committed wage theft, they'd be fired. And Walmart can say, you see, we have great compliance efforts. Now, here's the thing, and this is our next chapter. This system, which Sam Walton devised back in the 70s and 80s, Jack Welch, the manager of the century, highly touted from 1980 to 2000 as CEO at General Electric, credited with turning it around, hailed for his management system. Turns out he's really doing all the same things Sam Walton was doing. And when we looked at Welch, I mean, we think Welch would be turning over in his grave. He's died recently. At the comparison with Sam Walton and Walmart, GE being one of the great companies in the United States at the time. But in fact, he was doing the same thing. And what he's really doing, what he is hailed for doing, is he thought executive compensation should be aligned with shareholder interests, not multiple stakeholders. He prided himself on a rank and yank evaluation system, stack ranking, think of a forced curve just like first year in law school, that compares executives against each other. And the top 20% or so are given outside bonuses, including stock options. The bottom 10% or so are identified as failing and in line for dismissal. And he would redo this every year. 93% of the executive pay gap for executives, according to the New York Fed, comes from bonus pay. But bonus pay before Welch was relatively modest. It grew substantially, and both at Walmart and GE could be something like 2/3 of total salary. What's going on at GE? Well, we call the system, not original to us, plausible deniability. Dangle big bonuses for those who produce the right numbers. Don't ask questions about where the numbers come from. Internal competition keeps everybody off balance. People who complain, sour grapes. You're complaining because you didn't get a big bonus. That allows the CEO, and Jack Welch bragged about this, to get anything he wants. And what did he want? Earnings management. So GE was the toast of the town because in his 20-year reign, earnings increased something like 300%, 300, 400%. Share price increased 4,000%. At GE, they beat earnings expectations almost every quarter for 20 years. How do you do it? Well, Jack Welch loved to brag. He liked to say, reach down into the ranks, pick people brimming with confidence. That's the quality you wanted. Break through the bureaucracy. Let them do anything they want, so long as they meet their numbers. But this is securities fraud. And in the book, we profile a woman who is, was general counsel to one of the divisions at GE. And before she got there, that division had been manipulating the earnings with help from GE Finance. And the SEC launched an investigation. And what her boss really wanted was a general counsel with clout. Think of somebody like Bill Barr rather than Jeff Sessions. Somebody who could work the internal dynamics of the company to keep the employees who were guilty of fraud because the CEO really needed them. And so what happens when you have a system like this? Well, nationally, securities fraud is believed to be, the estimates are 10 to 18% of the companies. This kind of earnings misstatements, 40 to 70% of companies. And overall, what happened? Enron is the poster child for adopting the system, so is Boeing. Greater emphasis on, when you have rankings tied to large disparities in compensation, it produces greater emphasis on self-interest, on narcissism, hubris. Higher levels of distrust that underlie teamwork. This system is called the evaluation system at Microsoft that destroys your best employees. Greater homogeneity in corporate management, less managerial accountability, more politicized decision-making, more ethically questionable behavior. We call this the New Boys Club. And the purpose is to outflank the old boys, the institutional players who say this is the way we do things here, we care about our employees, we are honest about our accounting, they're toast. And the new boys then have to be looking over their shoulder who's coming behind them. So finally, the finance study, we talk about Wells Fargo. Nancy has already mentioned most of it. Simply want to note, and we talked to a woman at Wells Fargo who had been trying to do it right, trying to coach employees how you could get customers to voluntarily open multiple accounts instead of faking them. She got fired because the Wall Street Journal wrote something about her. Men working next to her who had committed worse misconduct were not fired. And when we asked her why, she said because their bosses were in on it, the bosses couldn't fire the underlings without also being at risk themselves. Her boss had already been fired. She had nobody to protect her. So when you look at this, and I want to emphasize Mark Egan in this study about why the men are 30%, or 20, women are 30% less likely to get new jobs than the men. Why? Because there is a market for misconduct. What Mark Egan told us is they get hired at other financial firms that basically specialize in ripping off their customers, and they're looking for people willing to bend the rules or break the rules and get away with it. So on that, again, Wells Fargo in the study had the largest gender disparities of any financial firm in the country with respect to gender differences in termination for misconduct. I'm going to say one more thing and turn it over to Nancy. What about tech? I'm going to say more about tech later, but I want you to look at that graph. Tech has been on a roller coaster since the 80s. In the 80s, men and women's interest in tech rose and fell together. starting with that huge, you see the huge boom? That's the 90s, the dot-com boom. What happens? You need a 4.0 to get into computer sciences at Berkeley, and the men crowd the women out. What happens in the downturn? Both groups turn down, and then after the financial crisis, what I call the red hots, that's what we used to call them in law school, the really ambitious, aggressive men went from finance back into tech. And what happens is a crowding out of the women, partly because you need a whole lot of hubris to believe you're going to succeed, and partly because the men who are attracted to a highly competitive environment are also the most likely to engage in things like sexual harassment, bullying, and other conduct that drives women out. Nancy?
When we talk about the book, people always ask us two questions. So I'm going to ask them for you. It's kind of an occupational hazard, this asking questions thing. The first question that we get asked is, aren't there laws that can address what is in effect sex discrimination? Well, sex discrimination suits are designed to deal with a world of relative equality. And the system we're describing isn't about equality. It's about an abuse of power. Lawsuits are not bad. We're law professors. We would love to believe, at least hypothetically, in the rule of law. And many of you, like Emmy, are going to be out there changing the laws. But there are difficulties with bringing individual and even class-based discrimination suits. The Supreme Court has effectively gutted class actions for damages, even if women are willing to come forward and to live a lawsuit. Individual discrimination lawsuits face sharp statutes of limitation and extreme damage caps. They haven't changed since 1991. Attorneys just aren't willing to take them. One of the biggest difficulties of all, though, is that employers may have a market defense. These competitive promotional practices that we've been talking about are under the radar because they look like background market decisions. And if companies use some form of incentive system, and about 95% of companies do, even if women can show discriminatory impact, employers may be able to establish a business necessity defense by showing that this challenged practice is job-related and consistent with business necessity. But the central problem is that discrimination lawsuits are mostly irrelevant. We're describing a system that centers on abuses of power with subtle messages. Yes, sexual harassment is about abuse of power, but many of the behaviors we talk about don't fit under the Title VII umbrella. Even though the WTA economy is a system that harms women, it also harms non-conforming men. And Title VII wasn't created to rectify power imbalances in the workplace. Now, there may be a bright spot, and June will pick up with this in a minute, in terms of using sexual harassment laws plus whistleblower lawsuits that shine a light on particular companies in order to bring out these abuses of power in the context of larger corporate practices. But those aren't every lawsuit. The second question we get asked is, what can women do? Women are given a lot of career advice, and you've probably heard some of it. How many of you are law students? Got a few? How many of you are lawyers? Got a few more, and I love it that the law faculty also raise their hands and identify as such. This is good. Well, women are given a lot of career advice. They're advised to lean in. They're advised to lean out. They're advised to be girl bosses. I mean, this is not a self-help book. We aren't here to tell women how to navigate a broken system. We think the best advice, in fact, is to change the system, not to change the women.
So I'm going to talk better takeaways. And my first, by the time we were done with this book, I became pretty radicalized against the left as much as the right. Why? We started this book as kind of the report card on women. And we can add to it lots of discussions of race and other kinds of disparities. But I think that's the wrong lens. So if you think about this graph, this is really a graph used to measure income inequality in the United States. And look at those low points. The low points, 1950, 1970, begins to change in 1990, which is where our story picks up. Title VII and the Equal Pay Act were passed in the 60s based on a principle of equality, a fight to gain the privileges of white men. I think talking about the privileges of white men in the new system is meaningless. The old system, narrow portals of entry, lockstep bonuses, promotions from within. If you got your foot in the door, you were on your way. And the kinds of companies like GE we're talking about excluded women and racial minorities from management ranks on a wholesale basis. The fight was to get a foot in the door, and all the doctrines Nancy was talking about were thought about in those terms. This is not a system about equality among white men. It is a system of radical equality that keeps everybody insecure. How do you think about the system? Well, as I said, when we started, this is a report card on how women were doing. I think that's the wrong question. It's a system about abuse of power. And if it's a system about abuse of power, well, you fight back in a different way. Abuse of power is ugly. The lawyers in the trenches we talked to talked about trying cases in the press. When you look at Me Too, part of it is, think of Roger Ailes, think of Harvey Weinstein, think of the figures who fell as a result of this. It's ugly. When we looked at the cases that succeeded, we don't find them succeeding by going to the Supreme Court, although some of them do. What we found is a real shift. Let's talk about sexual harassment. The CEO at McDonald's was found to have some racy text messages on his cell phone with underlings, employees. Not so egregious. And the board said to him, well, you can fire, but we're going to fire you, but you can quit and walk away with dignity. But tell us, is there anything else? He said, nope, nothing else. They required that he turn over his cell phone. They found out he was having affairs, not just racy text messages, physical affairs with consenting employees, and more than one. $100 million clawback of compensation from the CEO at McDonald's. And one of the things that happened, let me see if, nope, I'll get to that in a minute. The Delaware Chancery Court, the hero. Delaware used to be the place you went for a corporate-friendly world. The Delaware Chancery Court ruled in 2023 that the HR director at McDonald's could be liable for breach of fiduciary duties because he didn't investigate the party atmosphere at headquarters, including not only the CEO, but the head of HR. And this means you could sue him in a shareholder's action. There are no damages caps. All the limitations Nancy talked about that apply to Title VII actions don't apply. It's an entirely different way of thinking about this. And if you want to protect against sexual harassment, there's a 2022 study. Every woman you add to the board, you get a 22% decline in workplace complaints about sexual harassment. This is the way to go. Well, what about whistleblowers? That's also ugly. We're finding more lawyers, including whistleblower complaints. And the Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision within the last year, has ruled not only for whistleblowers, but upheld the stronger interpretation of the statute and the grounds for complaint. We find the lawyers we talk to are combining whistleblower and harassment allegations with discrimination claims because you can get a quick settlement and you can embarrass the company. You don't have to rely on winning before a hostile judiciary. What about farther-reaching reforms? Well, my prediction. When we look at what did we do the last time when the robber barons were in charge? If you look back and you see there were major downturns in 1873, that downturn was responsible for the end of Reconstruction. 1897 created the foundation for the Progressive Era. 1907 and then 1929, and that ushered in the New Deal. From 1929 until the savings loan crisis, there were no major fraud-fueled financial crises. But there have been since. We're overdue. What does this produce? Here's where we're going to end up, and this is really fairly speculative. Looking at tech and finance, what we see happening, and again, we view women, the canaries in the coal mine. I have no idea what's going on in tech and finance. I'm only telling you what this looks like when you look at women. In mainstream finance, which, you know, a little bit contrite after the financial crisis, after 2016, when the recovery really took hold, 40% increase in women in the senior VP levels, 50% in the C-suite. This is the top of mainstream financial companies, a major increase in women, and when we ask people, they say DEI. We have a somewhat different theory. Our theory is it's splitting in two. There is the rule-following part of finance that worries about compliance, and there are the cowboys. The cowboys are hedge funds and private equity. So if you look at hedge funds, they grew from 500 million to 4.3 trillion in assets by 2023. 97% of the industry assets are being managed by white men. And it's extremely hard to get data on what they're doing. There's relatively little accountability in comparison with mainstream financial firms. And what's coming next? Crypto. I'm not going there. I only want to highlight NASDAQ. So, wonderful NASDAQ report that says, and by the way, the social scientists all say, add women and stir. Women don't give you better results necessarily, but the traits associated with women do. So NASDAQ found the more diverse the boards and the auditors, the more transparent, better reporting discipline, lower likelihood of Jack Welch-type earnings management, increased disclosure of forward-looking information, lower likelihood of securities fraud, and fewer, audit qualifications requiring you to redo the numbers because of mistakes. And they required more diverse boards. Again, a sign. Women are associated with following the rules, mainstream institutions, but not the exploding part of the industry that breaks the rules. How about tech? Well, between 50 and 70% of VC-backed startups went out of business last year. The tech bros can't wait to be released from further regulations, but this is the part I want to emphasize. There has been an almost minuscule, there's been an increase in the number of women founders, but the percentage of money going to women founders has stayed under 3% of all venture capital funding. There has been an increase in the number of women co-founders. And with this downturn, startups that have women co-founders have a 25% lower burn rate. Why? Because women co-founders pay themselves less. There has been a 12.5% faster exit rate for two reasons. More solid management, but also less gaming of the numbers. Ask me about it during the questions. But if you look at sexual harassment, which has been pervasive in tech, the rates are essentially unchanged, and in the current downturn, women are 65% more likely to be laid off. So we ask the question, is there a new economy? Women are up to 10% of CEOs, an all-time high, on Fortune 500 and the S&P 500 companies. And look what's happening to women-led firms. They are doing better, and the rate, the difference between the blue line and the red line has been increasing over time. What do we think is going on? Well, here's my prediction. I see, just looking at women, a greater divergence between the well-run, sober companies that have relative transparency and relatively high rates of compliance, and the cowboys who are still seeking to break the rules and get away with it. Nancy, if you want to finish up.
So we had a conversation at dinner last night. We asked each other, can we end on an up note? Is there anything promising? Of course, June said, yes, in these dark political times, the revolution is coming. And she's very adorable when she starts bouncing. But we aren't really ready to go there yet. We're doing our part, of course, but we're not quite ready. What we have learned that is most promising is collective action and sunlight. And we think they are the best responses to the winner-take-all economy. Women fight back most effectively when they expose the ugliness. This was the Me Too movement, right? For centuries, women suffered indignities and sexual assaults in silence, and silence has never helped women. In 2017, actor Alyssa Milano tweeted #MeToo. It was a term that activist Tarana Burke had developed in 2006. Within a year, there were 19 million Me Too tweets. It was a call for action and for accountability rather than a source of shame. And Me Too involved turning the tables on those who had used accumulations of power to ensure their own invulnerability. So Me Too served as a form of jujitsu. It turned the power of celebrated men to act with impunity into a weapon against them, using their very celebrity to topple them. Me Too had a stunning impact. 2018, the New York Times documented more than 200 men who'd been brought down by reports of misconduct, many of whom were replaced by women. We think the real fight is between people who are stuck in zero-sum competitions that have negative-sum consequences and those of us who see the prospect for positive outcomes. And precisely because women can't win a rigged game, as we've been talking about, they are more likely to embrace what have historically been known as feminine values: caring, nurturing, loyalty to people, loyalty to institutions. And these aren't values belonging exclusively to women. I would offer Exhibit A, your dean, Mike Schwartz. And as recent economic data indicate, those values can drive longer-term business successes. So we think the community is more than the sum of its parts, and we also think that we're all better off when the community is stronger. We hope that we have provoked you for our last 10 minutes to engage in a conversation. And so we'd love to open the floor and have you chat, offer your comments, ask us questions. What do you want to talk about? What can we tell you?
Donald Trump.
You know, we have an op-ed out indicating how Trump has taken the same tactics we described in the business area and brought them into the political arena. And those tactics are: power is personalized, not institutionalized. Make everybody insecure, create artificial sense of crisis, pit people against each other. If one group is gaining, the other group has to be losing, and then say, I alone can fix it. But that's what we just described. Rachel?
Yeah, so I guess I have a question in terms of, what are business schools teaching?
You know better than I do.
Tied to that?
I have a daughter who just went through business school. She went sort of at the end of COVID, and apparently her professor at Booth said, was bopping up and down and saying, supply chain, you're in my supply chain class. Nobody's ever cared about supply chain in 17 years, and they are now. So business schools are heavily emphasizing supply chain. They are attentive to increasing the number of women in business schools. The messaging, though, within classes, and my limited universe is n equals 1 at this point, is not that there are I've asked, are there classes on leadership? Well, yeah, there are classes on leadership. Do they talk about gender? Not so much. They talk about the qualities necessary to promote economic gains for corporations. So I don't know what all business schools are doing, but I don't think they're doing this. And that's a great question. You know, where can the conversation start, right?
Yeah, can I add something? So when I've given this talk to business audiences, I found to my surprise I didn't get a lot of pushback on this picture. But what they're focused on is, well, can we retool the incentive structure to be somewhat more long-term? You really can get fired for sexual harassment in a mainstream company, and clawbacks for all kinds of things are now on the table. But one of the responses to Delaware, and the Delaware Chancery Court takes this picture quite seriously and has for at least the last 15 years, is companies moving out of Delaware. So again, that's one of the reasons for this split. The mainstream business community is concerned about this. And all it does is push a higher percentage of finance into hedge funds and private equity, a higher percentage of tech into, somebody at the last conference we were at is writing a book on the untamed unicorn, which is about how successful startups don't want to go public, that is to be publicly traded on the stock exchange, because it would require greater oversight and boards with more real power. Donald Trump will make all of these things worse. The lack of regulation, lack of oversight, lack of transparency.
Yeah, Mike?
So I'm going to beg you to make me not worry as I am. And we see this explosive growth in the percentage of women going to law school, but we're not, as far as I can tell, not seeing the payoff in law firm leadership. Yeah. And is it for similar reasons, or what's your take on the slow pace of growth in law firm leadership?
Go ahead, you can start.
All right, so there's been a 37% increase in law firm equity partners in the last few years. When that happened, there was also a substantial increase in the pay gap among law firm equity partners by gender. This is partly because the new women coming in are at the bottom. This 37% increases after 20 years of essential stagnation in the percentage of women in top equity partnerships. But that's not the big story. The big story is, if you go back, to the 80s, law firm partners could say no to clients. Now, if they say no to clients, the clients just find somebody who will say yes. And what you see is that where the average guy who's a law firm equity partner is making $1 million a year, the average woman is making $600,000 a year, but they're putting in the same hours. So why bother?
I think there are things that can be done about it on an individual level. We've written other articles about the absence of diversity in various companies and in law firms. We think the absence of diversity is a huge tell. And for those of you who are going to be looking for jobs after you graduate, or for those of you who are teaching classes to students that are, I assume, predominantly women, at least here and across the country, about 55% of entering classes for all law schools are women. Having people research what used to be, for folks who used to be at a firm, and those are the people to talk to. There's some old books, if there are any librarians here, they can tell you how to find the Martindale Hubbles that used to be the old books, or we keep them like in our basement. But go and find, for those of you who are looking like, okay, is this a good place to work? You'll have the red carpet rolled out for you if you're a summer associate, and they'll tell you all about the good things with the firm. You want to talk to the people who used to be there, go and find out who used to be there, and they will tell you the accurate stories and the real stories about the history of the firm. So find what the firm looked like 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Talk to those folks and see if that's a firm that's on the right trajectory. It's a particular kind of research that people might not think about doing. I think there are some promising aspects on that individual horizon for people. There's an increase in the willingness to mentor. And as the numbers increase, yes, they're increasing incredibly slowly, right? We've got, 55% entering classes are women. We've got now 38% of all lawyers are women. There is that trickle as we move upward to equity partners. We're still only talking about a quarter of all senators and representatives are women. So the call to get involved in political action, get involved in it at a very low level. I mean, if the Federalists are right, if we believe them, but do they lie? If the Federalists are right and they are saying that that action at the state and local levels is important, get involved at the state and local levels. If the Department of Education is going to be dismantled, get involved at the school board level. I mean, get involved at the levels at which it's going to matter. So I don't know if that's going to make you feel at all better. Mezza. We've got time for one more question if anyone has one.
So one of the charts that you showed in the slide deck seemed to show a bigger advantage for women CEO-led companies as time goes by, almost hinting that there's a sense of slow and steady wins the game, that women tend to lead companies that have longer sustainable success. Whereas my question is that in today's business environment where AI is everywhere, the VC's expectation is different from 5-10 years ago. Usually on average, I think 5-10 years ago, you would see startup companies have a runway of at least 5 years. But now, like they barely have 2 to 3 years of runway. Within the investor wants to see results, disruptive growth, exponentially growth result in a very short period of time. And that seems to be against this advantage of the women CEO. If we do not have a big recession coming ahead of us, giving us a chance, giving women a chance to cut in and have a new generation of CEO to grow, what's our future then?
So one of the reasons I showed the text slide that shows the roller coaster is, this book went through at least 2 complete manuscripts that have very little to do with each other. We have a lot more data besides what's in the book. But one of the things we found is when you look at the pernicious part of this, there's a selection for people who are narcissists, amoral, over-optimistic, and have unbridled confidence. And when you select for those traits, you find they don't produce better results. They produce more big wins and more big losses. When you look at the folks, and the gender differences among young people are enormous now. And one of the things you're seeing is more men who are willing to gamble. Either I win big or I tear the entire structure down in my head and everybody else. With women who have more confidence in the system itself, in institutions, and aspire to more institutional as opposed to personalized leadership, instead of personal dominance, being the steward, like a 50s CEO of a company where you care about the stakeholders. And these are radically different worldviews. Well, here's the thing. When you have this roller coaster, you almost always see fewer women, more fraud, and downturns that crash and burn and take a lot more people with them. So my prediction, my optimistic prediction.
You're still hoping for the revolution.
Yeah,
I know.
I just hope that Trump crashes the economy quickly, as opposed to starts World War III. Not because he's going to start a war, but because if you undermine the forces of international order, if you deinstitutionalize at the global level, you set up the opportunity for war. I'm hoping he simply crashes the economy in like 3 years. But the focus on it is really a focus on the instability that is inevitable when you have personalized power instead of institutionalized power. So institutionalized power is bureaucratic. My pitch is we need to recover the idea of the rule of law as a good thing. But it's slower. It's a pain in the ass, I know. Minnesota is the most bureaucratic place I've ever been, but it's not necessarily badly run. And when you break free, which is what crypto wants to do and the startups want to do, and you move fast and break things as your mantra, you inevitably, you might produce real highs, but you're also going to produce real lows. And the roller coaster itself is destructive. That's my optimistic takeaway.
You should see her when she gets down. We want to thank you so much for coming and for chatting with us tonight. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.